Opposing narratives. Democrats and Republicans both claim victory following the first day of public hearings in the impeachment investigation into President Donald Trump. Our team coverage includes reports from Capitol Hill and the White House. Vatican Finance Minister. Pope Francis fills an important Holy See position left vacant for 2 years. We're in Rome. Fight for the unborn. An update on the last abortion clinic in one of the largest cities in Ohio. And meeting of bishops. Analysis of this week's USCCB Fall General Assembly. On EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, November 14th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. Speaker of the House of Representatives Nancy Pelosi accuses President Donald Trump of bribery. Pelosi pushing back against Republicans' defense of the president after the first round of public hearings of the impeachment investigation. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi kicks off our team coverage. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Wyatt. Most Americans, at least a majority, support these impeachment inquiry. And Morning Consult Political recent poll found that most Americans say their opinion's not going to change, and that's exactly what we're finding here on Capitol Hill. With that, the first public impeachment hearing wraps.
We haven't even made a decision to impeach. That's what the inquiry is about.
It could end with the House charging the president with an impeachable offense. The Constitution lists them treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors.
The bribe is to grant or withhold military assistance in return for a public statement of a fake investigation into the elections. That's bribery.
If the Democratic-controlled House votes to impeach President Trump, the Republican-controlled Senate would host a trial.
Nothing happened here. We're not going to impeach this president over this. We're not going to legitimize a hearing where you can only call Democratic witnesses. It's over. It's done for me.
The Democrats' first witness yesterday was Bill Taylor, the head of the American embassy in Ukraine. Millions of Americans watched as he spoke of his talks with the ambassador to the EU.
What I heard from people, and in this case it was what I heard from Ambassador Sondland, he described conditions for the security assistance and the White House meeting in those terms. That is, that were dependent upon, conditioned on pursuing these investigations.
This impeachment investigation probes President Trump asking Ukraine's president to investigate Joe Biden's son.
Never once did President Zelensky announce that he was going to start any type of investigation into Burisma or Biden's. Never once. And yet the aid got released. So the facts are the facts.
Yet Democrats ask,
if this is not impeachable conduct, what is?
The open hearings pick up again tomorrow with the former ambassador to the Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, will be testifying. She was ousted from that position earlier this year. Wyatt?
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reporting. Thanks, Jason. President Trump says the whole impeachment inquiry is a waste of time. He took to Twitter today, again, to share his thoughts and blasted the Democrats leading the inquiry. White House correspondent Mark Irons continues our team coverage. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. The Trump campaign is turning the impeachment inquiry into a fundraiser. It's trying to raise $3 million to, quote, end these fake impeachment hearings.
President Trump blasted the impeachment inquiry today on Twitter, writing, "This impeachment hoax is such a bad precedent and so bad for our country." Counselor to the president, Kellyanne Conway, says yesterday's public hearing on Capitol Hill offered nothing new.
In a real court of law, we would not be referring to something as evidence that is, oh, someone on my staff recalled overhearing a conversation between someone else and the president where they think they heard the president use the word investigations.
President Trump was asked about the public hearing just after it finished.
This is a sham and shouldn't be allowed.
He still wants to know who sparked the impeachment investigation in the first place.
Because the whistleblower gave a lot of very incorrect information, including my call with the president of Ukraine, which was a perfect call and highly appropriate. And he wrote something that was much different than the fact.
The president kept up the pressure today, tweeting, "Where's the fake whistleblower?" The Trump campaign also released a statement saying, in part, people don't need to rely on third-party opinions when they can see the facts for themselves. White House Press Secretary Stephanie Grisham adds, Democrats made clear just how weak their case is. Fact is, Democrats have already decided that Trump is guilty. The hearings are only meant to convince the public.
The president says he didn't even watch yesterday's public hearing because he was too busy with the president of Turkey meeting with him. His schedule tomorrow is mostly empty, but it's still not clear if the president will follow the proceedings against him. Wyatt?
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. There's another Democratic candidate entering the race for the White House.
I admire and respect the candidates in the Democratic field. They bring a richness of ideas and experience and a depth of character that makes me proud to be a Democrat. But if the character of the candidates is an issue in every election, this time is about the character of the country.
Deval Patrick is the former governor of Massachusetts. He's entering the race just 3 months before primary voting begins. He's close friends with former President Barack Obama. Patrick is a supporter of abortion and same-sex marriage. The United States is pressuring European countries to take back and prosecute their nationals who are fighting for ISIS. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo issued the challenge at a meeting of the International Coalition fighting the Islamic State in Washington, D.C. Many detained ISIS fighters are from Europe, but their countries have been reluctant to take them back. Pompeo says bringing them to justice is critical to preventing ISIS from exporting its ideology. At least 2 people are dead and several others are injured following a school shooting in Southern California. The student gunman is in grave condition after shooting himself. The shooting occurred this morning at Saugus High in Santa Clarita. The White House says President Trump is monitoring the situation. An international team investigating the downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 over eastern Ukraine 5 years ago says it is possible Russia was involved. Their findings suggest links between Moscow and separatists in Ukraine were closer than previously thought. The team also issued another appeal for witnesses to come forward. Nearly 300 people were killed in the 2014 crash. A ceasefire between Israel and Gaza's Islamic Jihad militants appears to be holding up. Israeli President Reuven Rivlin says his country is not looking to escalate the violence, and quiet will be met with quiet, quote. The agreement ends 2 days of intense fighting. Israel closed all schools and workplaces in Tel Aviv after a series of rockets were fired into its communities. Israel launched airstrikes in response. 34 people from the Palestinian territory were killed. Janine Áñez was sworn in yesterday as interim president of Bolivia. The former senator is already facing challenges to her leadership. Violent clashes broke out today between police and supporters of former leader Evo Morales. Security forces fired tear gas to disperse the crowds. Pope Francis is calling for technology companies to take steps to prevent children from being able to view pornography.
Dello sviluppo tecnologico e hanno accumulato risorse economiche ingenti.
The Holy Father was speaking at a conference of religious leaders and technology representatives at the Vatican. He says it's no longer enough merely to follow the law in monitoring online content. Instead, he's calling on the companies themselves to act in a morally responsible way. The Holy Father appoints a fellow Jesuit to oversee the finances of the Roman Curia and the Vatican city-state. Father Juan Antonio Guerrero Alves of Spain will be the new Secretariat for the Economy beginning in January. This position was left vacant for almost 2 years after Cardinal George Pell left Rome to stand trial on sex abuse charges in Australia. This comes 1 day after Australia's Supreme Court agreed to hear Pell's appeal of his conviction. With more on this story, we turn to Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register. He joins us from Rome. Edward, tell us about Father Guerrero and why he's been appointed to this position.
Father Guerrero, Wyatt, is a 60-year-old Jesuit from Spain. He's a trained economist. He has the responsibility of looking after the provincial houses of the Jesuits, a very responsible position. He also works closely with Father Arturo Sosa, who's the Superior General, the head of the Jesuits. He's also, I think he's been chosen primarily because of his expertise in economics, but also because, of course, he's a Jesuit like the Pope himself, and the Pope has been appointing quite a number of Jesuits recently. There was speculation that a lay person would be appointed, perhaps even a lay woman, but that clearly has not happened.
So what kind of challenges face Father Guerrero in his new role?
Well, his appointment comes at a time of quite considerable tension in Vatican finances. There's a raid on the Secretariat of State in the summer regarding a suspicious real estate transaction. There's also been turf wars between the old guard and those wanting to reform Vatican finances. And there's also a structural deficit that he's got to deal with of $76 million. So quite a lot on his plate.
It does sound like he faces a lot of challenges. How did Father Guerrero react to the appointment? And can we expect him to be elevated to a higher clergy position like a bishop or perhaps even a cardinal?
Well, he said he was surprised, very surprised and humbled by the appointment. He's in a statement that was issued this afternoon. But he also said that he requested to the Pope, and the Pope agreed not to elevate him to the episcopate, not to make him a bishop. And so he won't become a bishop or a cardinal because he wants to return after his mandate finishes to being a simple Jesuit father, he said. And this is very much in keeping with the Jesuit tradition because the Jesuits don't actually seek episcopal office, even though they may get appointed to them with some exceptions.
Very interesting with this story, and especially in light of the investigation into the Vatican's finances in general. Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Coming up, as the USCCB Fall General Assembly wraps up, a look at what to expect with Archbishop Jose Gomez as the group's president. The bishop who is investigating the response to clergy sexual abuse in the Diocese of Buffalo is facing an allegation of abuse himself. Bishop Nicholas DiMarzio is being accused of misconduct in an incident from the mid-1970s. Bishop DiMarzio, the head of the Diocese of Brooklyn, denies the claim. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops wrap up their Fall General Assembly today in Baltimore, Maryland. Among the main topics on the agenda, the bishops elected a new president and vice president for 3-year terms. Archbishop Jose Gomez of Los Angeles is the president-elect. He leads the largest diocese in the nation. Archbishop Gomez replaces Cardinal Daniel DiNardo of the Archdiocese of Galveston-Houston. Joining us now is Edward Condon, D.C. Bureau Chief for Catholic News Agency. Ed, welcome back to the program. You and I have covered several of these meetings over the years. Was there anything different or unique this time around?
Well, I think rather than it being different or unique this time, it was kind of a return to business as usual. The last two meetings for the bishops in June of this year and November last year were very much crisis atmosphere after the revelations about Theodore McCarrick and the sort of rolling and ongoing sexual abuse scandal that followed in his wake.
Speaking of Theodore McCarrick, some of the bishops asked for an update on the Vatican's investigation into McCarrick, now defrocked. How was it received, and is this controversial?
Well, it was interesting because the last time the bishops met, they discussed the idea of asking the Holy See in a very gently worded statement to publish a report on Theodore McCarrick as soon as possible, and that was voted down. This time, they added with an amendment from the floor to get an update from Rome on it, and this was given by Cardinal O'Malley of Boston. And, I mean, he didn't speak for long, but he made it very clear that they had hoped to publish a report already. This report is being compiled by the Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Parolin. Said that they'd hoped to have it for the U.S. bishops at this meeting in November, but that it had been delayed because they'd found a lot more information than they expected. Now, this is, in a sense, this is a sort of expected unexpected. As Cardinal, Theodore McCarrick's influence went everywhere, both in Rome and the United States, so that there's a lot to get through is not surprising. Now, what Cardinal O'Malley said was that the report had basically been finished in draft form. It was being translated into Italian. It was going to be presented to Pope Francis for his authorization to publish, and that he hoped we'd see it before Christmas, and if not, soon in the new year.
Okay, we'll keep watching. I know we all want to read it, not just the bishops. We now have a new president of the USCCB, Archbishop Jose Gomez. What do you think his priorities will be now that he takes over?
Well, I don't know that Archbishop Gomez is bringing a new set of priorities to the conference. He's obviously been serving as vice president for the last 3 years. So this is, if you like, a measure of continuity. This is why traditionally, not every time, but traditionally the vice president is elected president. So there is this sense of continuity and a continuation of the priorities of the conference as they've already been articulated. I mean, Archbishop Gomez is, of course, significant because he leads one of the largest archdiocesan groups of Catholics in the country. He's certainly the first Hispanic and immigrant to lead the conference, and I think in the current political climate where immigration, particularly along the southern border, is such a hot-button topic, he's perhaps a more recognizable and in himself a much more articulate figure to address these issues on behalf of the bishops.
You wrote a piece for Catholic News Agency saying it appeared the bishops were at odds over abortion as a preeminent priority and what you called the Pope Francis test. What did you mean by that?
Well, so it was a very interesting moment. I'd say probably the only really interesting moment from an external point of view during this bishops' conference. They were discussing what appeared to be a very mundane issue, which is they have a document, they've had a document for several years called Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, which is really the bishops' advice to American Catholics on how to form their consciences in elections. They wanted to have a series of short videos to accompany this document, which was new this year, and they wanted a brief letter to accompany the videos. Pretty in the weeds, as it were, nothing earth-shaking. But what happened was an amendment was proposed by Cardinal Cupich of Chicago, and he said he'd like to see in the text of the letter accompanying these videos a longer quote from Pope Francis on the sort of conscience priorities around life issues that the Pope has articulated, most especially abortion, but also the poor, the marginalized, the sick, the elderly, the infirm, all of these categories of persons that are very important. Now, there was a bit of back and forth between Cardinal Cupich and Archbishop Gomez, who was presenting the letter, and it was clear that the only real problem they saw with including this paragraph was it would make the letter a bit longer, and they wanted to keep it short so people would read it. And there appeared to be a sense in the floor that everyone was fine with the proposed new paragraph. That was great, and it was ready to be voted on. But then Bishop Robert McElroy of San Diego got up, and he said that he was supporting the inclusion of this bigger paragraph quote from Pope Francis, but he was himself troubled that the letter referred to abortion as the preeminent concern of the bishops, and that this was the preeminent issue of our time. Bear in mind, we're dealing with abortion on a massive scale in this country, and it is perhaps one of the hottest political issues even outside of the Catholic community. Now, what Bishop McElroy did was he said that bishops who thought that abortion was the preeminent issue facing Catholics as they went to vote were out of step with Pope Francis. He said they were either in discord with the Pope's own teachings or opposed to it. Now, this triggered a huge response from the other bishops. Archbishop Chaput of Philadelphia got up and said this simply isn't true, and they ended up voting the amendment down. And the matter got a little confused because several bishops came out to me afterwards and said, we had no problem with Cardinal Cupich's proposed paragraph. We would have happily voted for it. But we're not going to have Bishop McElroy tell us that we're against the Pope because we recognize abortion as the preeminent issue, which it definitively is.
Edward Condon, D.C. Bureau Chief for Catholic News Agency, thank you so much for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
Up next, analysis of a new study saying anti-Semitic attacks are on the rise. Newly released data from the FBI shows Jewish people and Jewish institutions in the United States were the overwhelming target of religious-based hate crimes in the country last year. The agency's 2018 Hate Crime Statistics Report finds hate crimes motivated by religious bias accounted for more than 1,500 offenses. The majority of those offenses, almost 58%, were directed against Jewish people. Jews make up about 2% of the U.S. population. Melissa Braunstein, senior contributor for The Federalist, joins me now with her analysis. Melissa, welcome back to the program.
Good to be here.
What's your reaction, first off, when you hear about these disturbing figures?
I think the unfortunate news is that it's not new. This has been the case for the last several years. That Jews in America have held the dubious distinction of leading in hate crimes against religious communities. It's something that's been trending upward as an issue, and I'm glad that your show's paying attention to it.
You wrote a piece describing what you call the new normal for Jewish people in our nation's synagogues and throughout our society. What have you been witnessing personally in terms of over these years, and how much have you seen in terms of additional security?
Security has definitely increased. I think there's been a huge change since I was a kid. The world that my children are growing up in is very different. You could just walk into synagogues when I was growing up. There was no security, and now if you go to religious schools, you go to synagogues, you go to Jewish community centers, it's very common to see all sorts of security settings, to have key fobs, to have video systems set up, to have security guards, to have police officers. It's very rare now in a major city to go to a Jewish institution where there's not extra security. It's become normal.
And of course, churches are following the same trend. We all remember a little over a year ago when a mass shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh left 11 people dead, 6 more injured. The shooter reportedly had a history of posting anti-Semitic sentiments on social media. What role do you think the anti-Jewish rhetoric plays in fueling these kinds of incidents?
I think the rhetoric is a problem. I think people say this all the time, but it's very true that when you have sort of very fiery language, it very quickly can lead, in certain cases, to action. And Tree of Life is a great example of deadly action. It's something that I think, as much as possible, you want to preemptively stop before it starts, and which is not to say knocking out the First Amendment, but just to encourage people to be very careful of the language that they're using.
Just last month, the American Jewish Committee released its survey of Jewish people in the U.S. The responses indicate American Jews view anti-Semitism as a significant problem in America and one that is getting worse, just like you said. What do you think is needed to bring about change?
I would love to see more people, starting with your viewers, saying that anti-Semitism is not just a Jewish problem, that it's everybody's problem, that it's something that affects our democracy and our society. History has shown that what starts with the Jews typically does not end with us. This is a problem for our society everywhere. I would love to see more people speaking up to our elected officials and demanding that they take action and pay attention to this, that this is not a problem that just gets ignored.
Very important message. Melissa Braunstein, senior contributor for The Federalist, thank you so much for coming on talking with us.
Thank you.
A young pro-life woman passionately defends life. It came as the House Oversight Committee questioned states' pro-life laws.
It is incomprehensible to me that we are having a debate over whether or not it is acceptable to kill a baby before they're born. And while we discuss Democrats' concerns about abortion restrictions today, I want to remind the committee of the true victims of radical legislation, and that is preborn babies.
Committee Democrats condemned pro-life laws, singling out Missouri's policies. That state has only one abortion clinic, and Missouri has not renewed that clinic's license. The last abortion clinic in Dayton, Ohio lands the license it needs to remain open. The center had been unable to secure the legally required emergency patient transfer agreement, but it received enough doctor signatures to earn a waiver. Ohio Right to Life says it is disappointed by the decision to issue the license. Tonight on EWTN Pro-Life Weekly, Representative Ron Estes talks about the Down Syndrome Discrimination by Abortion Prohibition Act, a legislation that would ban abortions due to an unborn child's diagnosis with Down syndrome.
We don't want to determine who deserves to live or who dies based on the quality of the life that we think they might have. So we want to make sure that everybody has that opportunity.
You can learn more about the proposed law tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern on EWTN with guest host Debbie Cowden. Visit EWTN.com for other airing times. And that concludes our newscast for tonight. We thank you for watching. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.